Welcome to this webinar. We will wait another minute, waiting for people to join. So once again, welcome everybody. We're meanwhile with over 50 participants, so I think we can easily start. My name is Henk Singstra, and I'm the chairman of the Eurosite Management Expert Group. And for this webinar, we are very proud to have Professor Liesbeth Bakker with us, who will talk about climate-smart rewilding as a nature-based solution to climate change and biodiversity loss. Liesbeth is a senior researcher at the Netherlands Institute of Ecology and professor in Rewilding Ecology at Wageningen University Research. She works on rewilding and ecosystem restoration under global change in freshwater and marine wetlands, grasslands, and forest landscapes. Liesbeth is the project lead for rewilding practice in the WildE project. And WildE is a project funded by Horizon Europe that will develop climate-smart rewilding as a nature-based solution to the twin threats of climate change and biodiversity loss. I'm sure Liesbeth will tell you more about this exciting Horizon project and how rewilding can contribute to the implementation of the EU nature restoration law and at the same time support Europe's ambition to become climate neutral. Before giving the mic to Liesbeth, some housekeeping rules with which you will all be familiar by now. But please use the Q&A for questions and the chat to send messages to us or someone else in the audience. Now, here's the mic and the screen to Liesbeth. Liesbeth, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation to speak about rewilding today. Good afternoon, everybody. And thanks for attending the webinar as well. I will now share my screen so that we can get started. So I think this should be fine. So today I want to talk about two main aspects related to rewilding, namely what does rewilding mean, what is it really, and then how can research help to make it climate smart in relation to this Horizon Europe project that we have recently started. So first, I would like to zoom out and take a very long-term perspective on changes on the globe in relation to human encroachment on the planet, so to speak. And this is an infographic that I often use for this, which depicts terrestrial and marine environments over very long time scales. At the very left of the start of the time scale, it's 50,000 years ago. And of course, this was the time when we had truly very large animals called also megafauna, animals of more than 1,000 kilos that roamed the planet. And sometimes you can think a bit if you really like wild and you like very big animals, that maybe we are a little bit in the wrong time, so to speak, because quite a lot of it has been lost, unfortunately. So if you look on this long-term changes from the megafauna that started to be hunted with the arrival of people, and this has led to a number of extinctions, as we very well know. Over time, unfortunately, partly this has continued. You see it's a North American picture of the terrestrial environment. There's some bison there. that were killed massively by the colonizers as a means to suppress the native people. But it's not that there's no larger animals left. Of course, we domesticated livestock, and large numbers of livestock are now way more common than the actual wildlife on our planet. In marine areas, of course, there have also been major changes. The good news may be that there have been less extinctions of the megafauna there, such as whales, but we know, of course, there have been very strong reductions in their populations due to hunting as well. Then if we look at the very right, it's a bit into the future, you can say. And this paper came out about 10 years ago, and then you would think, this is so futuristic. They depict the solar panel landscape, these sort of greenhouse dome-shaped things there, that it seemed like unrealistic. But if you look around now and see the energy transition taking shape very rapidly, it's pretty common to see these solar panel fields by now. And also if you look at sea with the windmill parks emerging, which is also a very rapidly developing phenomenon. So this is the reality now. Now we all know that this has had major impact on the animals, in particular that we share the planet with, and nature in general. And this is of course very nicely documented in Living Planet reports. And I show one of those that you're probably very familiar with, that it has been documented that there's a strong and global decline in the abundance of vertebrate animals that have been systematically counted. And you see that by then it was 60% decline. I think the most recent report says now 73% of decline of these populations compared to what it was in the 1970s. So for me, it's almost a bit like a confronting picture sometimes, I feel, because I'm born in 1973 myself. So you can say during my lifetime already, this drastic decline in animals has actually taken place. Well, this is in freshwater habitats, for instance, even worse. So all in all, a pretty depressive picture. So there's other ways to show these trends, and this is another example, the biodiversity index. It's an index of different groups of animals and organisms that are placed also at the start, 1970, and then over time you also here see a decline in biodiversity in this case. And what you also see there is different writing in the graphic, and this relates to several policy treaties that have been tried to stop this decline in biodiversity. And we can see, of course, that this has not had a lot of impact because it has been an all-over decline very convincingly. And we can now even also add the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, of course, as one of the most recent ones, which hopefully may make the change. This has been known as the curve of biodiversity decline. And one of the main challenges of our time has been described as bending the curve, meaning to instead having the decline in biodiversity to go upwards and improve biodiversity again. So how can we bend this curve? Technically, you could say if we keep on going as we do, it's business as usual. It's expected to have a further decline. If we would have maximum conservation of what we still have, you can say maybe we can stop biodiversity decline, which would be already fantastic, of course. But it will not be enough to actually go upwards and to do this really upward bending of the curve to get more biodiversity over time. And that is why we need massive restoration. And we can also see that we have made many efforts to stop this decline in biodiversity and also to try to bend this curve upwards, but it has not been successful so far. So we need to find new ways how we can be able to do this. Of course, to emphasize, we first need to put maximum emphasis on conservation. So we don't want to have further declines of what we still have, especially the very rare species that may otherwise go extinct. But then we need to put massive efforts into this restoration. Now, there's maybe some good news that there is at least some momentum for ecosystem restoration. You can think of the global initiative, the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration, that we are almost in the middle now. At the European level, we have the Green Deal, biodiversity strategy, and the nature restoration law. Maybe not as in a shape that it could have been, but it is existing and is going to be enforced in the coming years and developed. And then at the national level, many countries have their own biodiversity plans. And in the Netherlands, for instance, we have the Delta Plan Biodiversity Recovery. So that's good. There is incentive, there are policies that are aiming for this massive ecosystem restoration. The big question is how to do this. And this is where rewilding comes in and why I want to talk to you about rewilding today. So rewilding is an approach to ecosystem restoration, which aims to create more room for natural processes. And you see here, Galloway bull is actually doing such a natural process, as you can say. It's being territorial and full of hormones and digging so-called bull pit, by which it's engineering its environment, and thereby it is creating these natural disturbances in the environment as an example of rewilding. Now, this is not the only form of rewilding. People often think with rewilding about the role of large animals, rightfully so, because these are very important. But there's also other forms of natural processes that you can think of that are actually abiotic. And then you can think, for instance, the role of water in landscapes. So if you are in peatlands or you are in a delta area like the Netherlands with large rivers and so, of course, the role of water in shaping our natural environments is a very natural process, and therefore also belongs to this concept of rewilding. Another aspect you can think of is, for instance, in the coastal areas, in the dunes, when there is a lot of wind effects blowing the sand into the dune valleys, for instance, providing new habitats for rare plant species that depend on these conditions. Also, this wind action is a very natural process that is part of rewilding and an abiotic process. Now, the other side is the wildlife side, so to speak, and that is what we often call trophic rewilding, relate to the trophic cascade with the role of top predators, but also the role of key engineering herbivores, such as we just saw this large Galloway bull, but also beavers, of course, are a classic example of ecosystem engineers. So there is different types of natural processes that you can think of when you would like to implement rewilding as a form of ecosystem restoration. Now, there's then two ways how this rewilding can take place, so to speak. One is what we call passive rewilding, and that means that basically humans step away, you stop human interventions, and then you let actually naturally regeneration take place in areas like you see here, without the further help of humans or the further intervention. The other one is active rewilding then, and that means that before you let natural processes take their way, you actually have interventions as humans to create certain starting conditions. And the reason is because by our influence as humans on the planet and the landscapes, of course, there have been losses of key engineering animals, such as this European bison. And when it has been removed from landscapes, you can feel like key elements are missing that would actually be very relevant natural actors in these landscapes. And therefore, you would like to first reintroduce several of these key players, and then you would like the area to develop naturally. Another example in the lower part is dam removal, for instance. If you like to rewild rivers, and we know that many of these have been dammed, of course, you would like to remove some of these dams, and people have been pretty active in looking up dams that are not fully functional or not essential, and to remove these to actually create this room for these natural processes that a river can then fulfill. So there's different ways how you can actually also implement rewilding. Now, what should we really focus on? What is very important if you want to increase biodiversity and restore habitats? Therefore, it's very helpful to go back to one of these Living Planet reports, because what they did is that they also documented the main causes of loss of the vertebrate animal populations that are monitored. So you see here for birds, mammals, fish, and reptiles and amphibians, they categorize the main causes of decline. And you see that there's several categories in those, but generally about 3/4 of the causes of decline are the first two elements, and that's habitat degradation or habitat loss, or exploitation, which can be hunting or fishing. And these two are responsible for the majority of declines in the vertebrate populations. So it is, if you want to make big impact, I would say it makes total sense to also focus on these two to start with. There they are. So if we look at these major threats, which are habitat degradation, habitat loss, and exploitation, then how can we translate that in a certain, what should we do to mitigate this? Of course, if you have habitat degradation, you need to improve the habitat, so do sort of habitat upgrading, so to speak, create new habitats in case of habitat loss. And for exploitation, you should either stop or at least reduce the hunting and fisheries towards, at the very least, a sustainable level, or stop it altogether, to actually promote the restoration of these ecosystems. So it's not that we don't know what should be done. Well, and in this case, rewilding could be helpful to see if it can actually improve habitats, help to create new habitats, or also stop this human intervention to allow development of the wildlife populations, and in total giving this room to natural processes. Essentially, if we look at many of these status updates of how is it going with the nature areas, well, we can very much say that in many areas nature is sort of on life support. It's not going great, and there's a lot of actions needed to even keep what we still have. And therefore, sometimes also for the general public, maybe the image is that nature is something that needs urgent protection. It's weak. There's a lot of red list species. And generally, if there's new reports coming out, it is even worse than before. So you get the feeling everything is going down, essentially. And in social sciences, this is what they call a philosophy of doom, like it's not going great, and we already know that the next message will be that it's even worse. The opposite of that is the image of nature being very strong, and that it can bounce back as soon as it gets the room to do so. And you can already feel a bit that this is where rewilding aims for, is the idea to give room to nature and have the faith in nature to come back by itself, because actually nature is very resilient. And that is in social sciences called philosophy of hope, that you actually see room for improvement, so to say. And you think that this can actually be realized. And there's, if you would like to read about this, Paul Jepsen has written a very nice article about these concepts in Ambio. Now you think, yeah, right, and you can speak about hope, but it can also be in vain, right? But there are indeed a number of examples of developments that are positive. For our case in the Netherlands, one of these examples is the return of the white-tailed eagle. So in the background here, you see a big wetland, the Oostvaardersplassen wetland area, which is for Dutch standards quite large. It's more than 3,000 hectares. And this is the place where we had the first breeding pair of the white-tailed eagle in the Netherlands almost 20 years ago now, which was actually an iconic event because at that time people were discussing whether this white-tailed eagle should be reintroduced in the Netherlands. But while they actually had a court case about whether or not it should happen, it almost that time came flying in by itself, which of course is one of the best ways of rewilding, so to speak, without human help. It comes by itself back. And that was quite spectacular. So another example, also breeding in this Oostvaardersplassen area before that time already. The first breeding colony of the great white egret was established in this wetland area. And for both of the white-tailed eagle and the great white egret, the story is that it's better protection of the species, like less exploitation. So they were actually no longer hunted, or in the case of the white-tailed eagle poisoned. And then there's this attraction of this big wetland area, let's say, as a place where they can start for the first colony or the first breeding pair. So a combination with creating new habitat that they could use and colonize, and stopping this hunting or other ways of exploitation has really made a difference here. And that's not the only example. You can also think of the gray wolf, for example, one of the very debated examples maybe these days, but a very good example of a tremendous increase in population size. You see a map here, and you see that the dark yellow areas are the expansion over time since 1965. There's on the east side a little bit of contraction of the populations there, and there are some stable populations that are more persistent. But the increase in population is spectacular. And also here for the Netherlands, it was unheard of that we would see wolves in our lifetime in the wild in the Netherlands. People could not even imagine. And there are more of these stories in this wildlife comeback report. Came out just over a year ago, and documents return of both predators, but also a number of bird species, reptiles, and shows that there are actually these examples of species coming back. And sometimes it's good that we think a lot of things can be very complex, like I'm an ecologist, and interactions in ecosystems with many species can be complex processes, or conservation can be very complex. But some things can be very simple as well. And the message that comes largely from this wildlife comeback is that the most dominant factor is actually protection of species. Basically, if we stop killing them, they come back. So from that perspective, there is hope, and it is not that it cannot be done. So rewilding as such has been considered a new conservation narrative, or maybe a restoration approach, both of them, I would say. And it has been in Europe, I think, for the last 15 years, becoming more and more popular. The idea of rewilding is that this biodiversity actually will be derived from natural processes. Rewilding is future-oriented. It wants to contribute strongly to this bending the curve. So it wants to increase biodiversity, learning from the past, but not necessarily directly going back to the past. We need to go to the future. The idea of rewilding is that it's progressive, moving up a scale of wildness. And that relates a bit to this word rewilding. Often people think of it has this vibe, so to say, of wilderness. But we all know if we look out of the window, I don't know where you are currently, but going back to pristine wilderness will not be possible in most of the cases, or if at all, you could argue that most places on Earth have been altered by humans and are influenced by humans now. And this has made rewilding on a crossroads, you can say. Sometimes people say, yeah, but you will not get this pristine wilderness. It's nonsense to aim for this. And I think they are right. This pristine wilderness, we will not get it back, and that is sad enough by itself. But for rewilding, it has been turned around very much in the Netherlands, and I believe also elsewhere in Europe, where people now consider the current state of the ecosystem or the environment where you are, and how can we make that wilder? And therefore, rewilding as such is more a verb than an actual state of a system. So it is working towards more wildness. And then often there's many steps you can take. There are new natural processes that you can give more room, or new processes that you can actually introduce. And often this gives people a lot of perspective of different actions that they could be taking if they look at the current state of the area where they are and how can we make this wilder. And that is what is meant with moving up the scale of wildness. You can often always make a new step towards more wildness. And then the last part, also very important, is that you can use nature actually as an ally in solving today's challenges. And this can be the biodiversity crisis. This can actually be much wider, and we will go into that a little bit later. First, this idea of biodiversity being derived from natural processes, which is a cornerstone of the thinking of rewilding. And the idea behind that is that plants and animals have co-evolved for an enormously long time. You can think, for instance, of spines on shrubs like the blackthorn, Prunus spinosa, which is there in response to large herbivore browsing on the shrubs. And you could even argue that these shrubs with these spines are still out there, even though the large herbivore populations that have originally browsed on them, part of them have gone extinct or are no longer there. But the landscape and the plants still maybe remember the presence of these animals in landscapes. And that is this aspect of co-evolution. So the idea also is that plants and animals, they were already there and they had a certain place in the landscape before humans arrived. Actually, we came later than most of these species had evolved. So therefore, the reasoning is that actually they should be fine by themselves, and they don't technically need humans to manage nature as such, because nature has managed itself for a very long time before humans even showed up. Now, of course, there's also some challenges ahead, and one of them is actually nature conservation and restoration, as we like to do it, that we often are targeting certain species that we want to protect or want them to come back in a certain system, whereas rewilding is a process-oriented form of restoration and therefore does not target specific species as such. It is a whole ecosystem restoration approach. And then people, of course, wonder if they want to protect certain species or they like to return them in a nature area, would that actually work with rewilding if rewilding is not particularly focusing on these species targets as such? And that's an important question, of course. Now, one of the answers is that, of course, whereas rewilding may be targeting processes, as a result, many species will respond to the changes in the environment if you give more room to natural processes. So there will definitely be species that are profiting from that type of rewilding. And therefore, what we want to do with research is that we investigate, if you do rewilding, what are the outcomes of rewilding? What does it mean in terms of biodiversity? And one of the areas where we do that is in the Velde Support. It's an area in the east of the Netherlands along the large rivers, the River Waal in this case, close to the cities of Nijmegen and Arnhem. And it's a 30-year-old rewilding area. And what we study there, it's from the WildE project on climate smart rewilding, of which I will tell more in a few slides. And here we want to investigate, as an example, demonstration area, if you do this form of rewilding, what does it deliver in terms of biodiversity? So together with the student, we try to dig up many reports on the different monitoring schemes that have been executed here. And this is one of the first results that we have. We looked at the plants, so there's the flora, which is a red list and a flora indicative of floodplain areas. And generally, most of the species have increased here. A few were stable and only very few have decreased in abundance. For mammals, there's some less mammals, but the few 4 have increased. Birds have increased a number of species, but also decreased because there have been major changes in the landscape structure. Amphibians increased and insects largely increased as well, with the loss of some certain species. So this is the type of documentation that I think science can also bring and analyze to demonstrate like what is the overall biodiversity trend upon rewilding of such an area, but also which species are profiting and which ones potentially not. Because if we know that, then we can match better also the different forms of rewilding with the schemes that are actually aimed to protect certain species. Now, other challenges on the road is finding space for rewilding. People sometimes think rewilding can only be done in a very large area, like 100,000 hectares or so. And of course, it is true that the bigger the area, the more room there is for these natural processes, and the more different types of processes together can work out in a landscape. But technically, the definition of rewilding does not have a scale in it. It's giving more room to natural processes, and that can also start in much smaller areas. And that is good because in densely populated areas, such as the Netherlands, but also other parts of Europe, of course, it's a challenge to find space to rewild. And therefore, it can be extremely useful to look for win-win scenarios where you can combine different targets that you may achieve with rewilding. And I will give some examples of that way of thinking. I think one of the best examples is the governmental Room for the River program that has been running in the Netherlands. And that started with a major river flooding in 1995. You see it here, the water was really in the houses of the people. And sometimes it seems like this is needed for people to realize what climate change means. What does it mean that there is more chance of extreme water levels and actual flooding? And this was one of these wake-up calls for people to think, okay, we need to re-engineer the way how we work with our water here. Because what was the problem? A lot of the big rivers are canalized to make it easier for ships to go through. But that means also that they became relatively narrow. And you see that people sometimes are living relatively close also to these rivers. So what traditionally was done, what the Dutch always do, is make dikes. And then the response to flooding risk would be to make the dikes higher and higher as a technical engineered solution. The problem was that if a river is small, the dikes are high, that if there is a breach of one of these dikes, that there's a tremendous flooding in the hinterland, which became too dangerous. So they rethought this and actually thought we need to provide room for the river. And this is where the program got its name. And this, of course, was never called rewilding by them, because the term rewilding only came from the US to Europe later. But the thinking behind it, to give room to this natural process of flooding by rivers in case there is a lot of water coming through. And they made side channels. They emptied part of the floodplain area so that no people would live there anymore, and at least no agriculture would be done there, but only in the inland. So there would be literally this room for flooding. And this was combined with the reintroduction of horses and some of this Galloway cattle, with the idea that these are proxy species for the extinct aurochs and tarpan, the wild horse that once roamed Europe. And they can actually eat part of this woody vegetation to make sure that there is enough room for this river in times of flooding. And people have been a pretty coarse analysis where they found that actually biodiversity has strongly increased in these areas altogether. So it seems that you can both do this flood risk reduction, which is a climate change adaptation measure, with big wins for biodiversity. And this is one of these examples where you can make this combination of solutions that actually serve multiple purposes. You can, of course, also think about climate change mitigation to capture carbon. And of course, many people are very eager to work with this. Often it looks a bit like this in the small scale then, because people want to do something good. They have these planting events, or you can do it at a much bigger scale. But the point is, where are the natural processes in this picture? Especially in temperate Europe, woody plants will establish by themselves. So it would not be needed to plant them. Of course, you can do it, but the need is not there. If you stop the management, then woody plants will appear everywhere. And you see that across Europe in areas where agriculture has been stopped, that you see woody plant encroachment. And in these landscapes also, you get separate, specific species, such as the red-backed shrike that thrives in these type of habitats. So also here you can have a win between woody plant establishment and biodiversity, which can combine climate change mitigation and biodiversity gains. Esther Blom, the director of ARC Rewilding the Netherlands, had written a visionary perspective about this in one of the Dutch magazines about wetland rewilding. Is the idea that if you would create at larger scale wetlands, you can have climate change mitigation by capturing carbon, climate change adaptation by having a buffer in times of flooding, water storage space, and biodiversity recovery. So potentially, with allowing rewilding, you could have a sort of win-win-win scenario. And this is actually the core of the climate smart rewilding project that we are currently running. It's called WildE for Wild Europe. And the idea is it's a Horizon 2020 project that we would look into rewilding for climate change mitigation and adaptation to see how it can simultaneously benefit biodiversity recovery, but also contribute to local economy and valued societal aspects. So it's a whole package, so to say, to see whether rewilding can contribute to these three topics and whether we can make these smart combinations. And if so, where in Europe, what type of habitat, what type of geography, where should we think of if we would like to make these type of combinations? And this is a research project where we try to investigate it. It's one of the famous European projects with like 22 partners across Europe, both scientific institutions, but also practitioner organizations. And it mainly functions like this. It has 5 objectives or work packages. I will very briefly run through. One is about rewilding baselines, and it tries to develop this concept of climate smart rewilding. What is that really, and how would climate change mitigation adaptation combine with biodiversity gain? And do we have examples across Europe where we could learn from that already may demonstrate some of these combinations? The second objective, that's the one I'm in charge of, is called rewilding practice. So the first one looks more conceptual and theoretical maybe, and at the European scale. And with a rewilding practice, we want to go to demonstration sites like the one I showed along the big rivers in the Netherlands, to actually see on the ground how people implement rewilding and whether they are able to have these win-win combinations for climate change mitigation, adaptation, for biodiversity, but also for society. And then the third one is about rewilding futures. So there is a strong modeling component there to look where could we potentially realize these win-win combinations across Europe, and how can we combine this with aspects like population density, for instance. The fourth one is about rewilding synthesis, is how we can translate the findings of this research and also make it fit for policy. So we have a very strong wish and task to communicate with policy at the EU level to implement this type of rewilding thinking with these win-win scenarios. And then we have a fifth objective to have a rewilding dialogue to talk to stakeholders, interested public and many other people, such as you, for instance, to share our thoughts about rewilding and to sort of team up, so to speak, so that we can not only tell you what we are doing, but we can actually also get input, because in the end, we will need to do this together. So this rewilding practice has 8 demonstration sites across Europe. They're pretty different. They're in different locations and also have quite different types of ecosystems. So there we want to learn locally with experts, for instance, to connect science and local practice to see what are these rewilding outcomes and opportunities in each of these local sites. And then, of course, we don't have a single expert. We have whole groups of stakeholders and people who are locally involved in these areas and can give us a lot of inside information. So we did this in the Netherlands. Well, then you see people have tons of reports and monitoring surveys that they could actually help us with to quantify these biodiversity gains. And we've done this in 4 of the 8 across Europe yet, so that we can actually really get local insights into this program. So to summarize, if you log off later, it would be great if you could remember that rewilding is about creating more room for natural processes, and that actually this can be done to the benefit of climate change mitigation, adaptation, biodiversity recovery, and economic and societal aspects. I think it is possible to make these combinations, and it would be really amazing if we can demonstrate this, but also get that into policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liesbeth. I was turn on the video. Here I am. Thank you, and very nice to give us some insight in the philosophy of hope, which is definitely something we need, looking at the biodiversity decline and the trends you were showing. Well, the challenge we have to at least stop this downgoing trend. There are at the moment 2 questions, and I will read them to you. The first one is about the Oostvaardersplassen, a very debated area. So the question of Alexei Lotman is, do you consider the Oostvaardersplassen a successful rewilding in spite of recent change towards more active management of de-domesticated cattle and horses?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so maybe first as inside information, the part that I showed was about the wetland part. And the debate is always about the grassland. This is the dry part, actually, and these are disconnected from each other, but still in the main extended Oostvaardersplassen area, of course. I think the term success is actually, it depends when do you call something a success? That is question 1, I think. So initially, the large herbivores were reintroduced in Oostvaardersplassen with the idea that they would graze a short vegetation of grassland that would be beneficial for the upgrowing chicks of the grey-leg geese that were breeding in this marsh area, and with the young they would then go to these grasslands to grow up. And now we cannot imagine that that was relevant because grey-leg geese are everywhere. People may even some argue that there's too many of those. But there was a time that we were actually really proud to have them re-established as a native breeding bird of delta marsh areas, such as the Oostvaardersplassen. And from that perspective, you can say, yes, it was a success. But then, of course, if you look at it from a perspective of an example of rewilding, I think definitely it is an example of rewilding, but it is also quite a unique case because of the local management previously to have the carrying capacity, the amount of food to decide how big the animal populations could be. That has never been applied in any other rewilding area, also not in the Netherlands. So I think from that perspective, we have learned a lot from it. And therefore, is that a success? Maybe you cannot necessarily label it like that, but I think it has been extremely valuable as a learning experiment, so to speak. Of course, it is unfortunate, I would say, that it has provoked so many debates. But I think maybe that has been part of the learning process, that you also see that now if people are starting a form of rewilding in a new area, that they will involve also the local people, those people surrounding this area. So there is a lot more attention about the societal embedding. And I think that's one of the lessons that is learned from there. So I'm a little bit hesitant to say failure or success. It depends a lot on how it started out. But I think we have learned very valuable lessons. I think that's the best way to phrase it.
Okay, thank you. There's another question from Vera Horagova. I hope I pronounce it correct, Vera. How do you define the term natural process? In a human-influenced landscape, it can be very difficult, she states.
Yeah, that's a very nice one, because that's indeed the essential, what is a natural process really. Of course, all our landscapes are heavily human influenced, so for sure, there's a lot of non-natural processes going on there. But I think when you look at geology, the local setting, the natural history of a place, that there are a number of processes that are inherently important. For instance, in the delta area, you have this wetland formation, you have the flow of rivers, this braided river systems with all sorts of gradients of wet to dry, of nutrient poor to nutrient rich, peat formation. So I think when you look at the more natural state and the geomorphology of the place, that you can think of a number of natural processes that may belong there and that are maybe no longer there at all, or they are partly still there. And from there you can think about, hey, what is missing here that could probably benefit the native flora and fauna in the area, because they are still adapted in a certain way to this geomorphology and the landscape context that belongs to, for instance, the delta area. So we know if we make things more wet, that benefits lots of species, and that makes sense because that's what a delta used to be. It used to be very wet. So I think if you look from that way, you can think of a number of processes that could be applied.
Thank you. Once again, there are quite a number of questions, so I'm afraid we cannot deal with all of them. So there's another question from Kazimierz Rabski, who says, thank you very much for this interesting presentation. He calls it a kind of Bible of rewilding. However, I cannot accept passive rewilding for many areas or habitats. But can you give any example of economic and social aspects?
In relation to
rewilding.
To rewilding, yeah. So just one from the area where we work in a lot now along these Dutch river areas. It used to be a corn crop field, essentially, where this rewilding program started with rewilding the river floodplains. So there have been an intensive scheme with the local farmers that they could get land, new farming land inside of the dike, so in a safe place for flooding. And then these floodplains were returned to nature, so to speak, so they were rewilded in certain ways. And one of the benefits for local society and also economic it has given a tremendous boost to recreation. So there's now 1.5 million visitors in this area per year, is what people have recorded, with a lot of accommodation. So it has been become way more accessible, because formerly the farming fields were just not accessible. You could look over it from the dike, of course, but that was about it. And now you have some walking tracks and things. And that's interesting because people often consider rewilding as something to exclude humans entirely. And that's not the form that at least we have. So we see that there have been very strong recreational benefits and people come out to enjoy nature, so to speak. So this has definitely given a boost to the societal aspects, but also to the local economies.
Yeah, clear. This is an interesting question from Steve Carver, who says, do you make a distinction between ecological restoration versus rewilding, and how? Or does it even matter?
Yeah, great question. Nice that you're listening also. I see rewilding as a form of ecological restoration. I know not everybody may see it like that necessarily, but for me, a lot is semantics, so to speak. So there's one problem, and that's the word restoration, because restoration as such suggests that you restore, so you go back in time to a certain state or image that you want to reproduce. And that I think is not appropriate in many cases, because humans have changed the landscape. There has climate change, as if things are changing. The conditions are different now. So even if we aim to restore, so to speak, we will often get a bit different results than it was exactly in the past. And that is okay, because that gives this future orientation. So that is what I am hesitant about when we use the word restoration as such. But that doesn't matter whether you're into rewilding or ecological restoration, you have the same problem. And I think people who are into ecological restoration as such also consider the future as much as they may do the past. So I think we should actually stop arguing a lot about definitions, because I would also say partly there is so much work to do and we know how urgent it is. So let's not argue about definitions, but let's go to work. And if you want to call it different, even be my guest, it's fine with me. It doesn't matter so much, but let's get the results out there.
Okay. There's another question from Ben Lebas, and it's also something you already noted. Ben is asking, I was wondering what your views were on how rewilding aligns or does not align with protected areas. Are protections for particular habitats or species going to prevent, in some signs, moving up to the scale of wilderness, as you put it?
Yeah, I think in principle, rewilding could align very well with protected areas, but it depends if you want to protect a certain state of the ecosystem. So you don't want necessarily it to be dynamic or change over time, but you want to keep a certain state because it has certain value or certain valuable species. Then it doesn't always align with rewilding, I would say, because rewilding is all about dynamic nature and let nature take its course. But that does not mean that it does not align with protected areas as such. It depends very much like what you want to protect and how you want to achieve that. I think there are many values that can also be protected when you do rewilding. One of the major concerns, for instance, has been about cultural landscape birds, for instance. You can think about yellowhammer or the turtle doves, for instance. But you see also these species, we associate them with agricultural landscapes. but they must have had a place in the landscape before humans were there and started to do agriculture. So sometimes we learn from these rewilding projects also that our native species that we think are farmland birds or other species actually can find a new place in wilder nature, so to speak, because that may align even with the time before humans started to make these farm fields. So I think also there we can learn things and maybe be surprised about where we can find our farmland species in a natural setting. But I don't think rewilding is always yielding specific results that you may want. And I think that is not a bad thing necessarily, because I think it's good that there can be different forms of ecosystem restoration. Some can be rewilding and some can be other means that can coexist together. I think the problem really is if we want to achieve everything in a small area, and I think the sign is then that we just need more. We need more room and more space so that we can have both worlds so together and different ways of ecosystem restoration. And sometimes these can even also strengthen each other. Something we see, for instance, we have quite nutrient poor wetland areas in the Netherlands where you have rare wetland birds breeding. But surrounding there are former agricultural lands that have been re-wetted to maintain the water level also in the core reserve that's very nutrient poor. And you see that these birds, they breed in the nutrient poor quiet core area, but they forage all in these former agricultural fields because these are relatively nutrient rich and have a lot of prey species. So sometimes you can also have more traditional or classical reserves that are managed by humans in whatever way, they're not rewilding, and combine it with wilder areas, and together they can be complete ecosystems. So also there, I think we should look for synergy, for ways how we can make smart combinations instead of that it's black and white, we have to choose this or that, and that is it.
Yeah. However, I have learned that there are sometimes conflicts between the rewilding approach and the protection of cultural historical landscapes. These two might not always be at the same level.
But, that is definitely true. But I think the point also is that I think if you have a very rare place with this certain ancient cultural traces in the landscape, so to speak, it doesn't mean that that is the exact site where the first place where you start to do rewilding, so to speak. I think there's many contexts or reasons that you want to do a certain type of restoration or conservation. And it's not that if you think rewilding can have certain benefits or so, that it means you need to always and everywhere do rewilding, period. We all know that diversity is valuable. And I think that also applies a bit to the forms of restoration and management, because they can each yield certain unique values. And I think if there are certain reserves with cultural heritage of some sort, outside of that, there is plenty of room to do massive rewilding, I would say. So you need to choose, where do you want to do it? Where does it bring most of the values?
Okay, yeah, maybe one last question, because it's we're running towards 5 o'clock, and that's about the scale. You have touched upon that, and there are more questions about that. And Margareta Penna asks, my question is about scale of rewilding initiatives. Looking at literature, it looks like only very wide areas can be considered for rewilding, 10,000 hectares or more. What is the potential for rewilding in your option for smaller areas?
Yeah, so maybe there are also probably people out there who may disagree with this, but I personally believe that rewilding is not bound to a certain scale per se. If it's bigger, yes, you can achieve more and it can be wilder, and you can have different types of processes, like complete herds of certain species of herbivores or so. Cannot be in a very small place, of course. So there's a limit to what you can do if it's small, but it doesn't mean you can do nothing. And this is why I really like this concept of making things wilder. That starts with your backyard, if you have any. If it's full of stones and you take out half of it, that's not very wild at all. It's a tiny, tiny step, but it's wilder than that it was. And I like this very much because it gives so much empowerment to even the individual and to even you with your own little patch of whatever you have to do something. And then you don't change the world directly by yourself, but it's a start and it's a way of thinking, because once you start, you think, hey, maybe I can do something more. And that's the way I see rewilding, and I think that makes it very powerful.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, there are many more questions. For instance, about the aspect of invasive species and how to deal with invasive species in rewilding projects. But I think we have to stop. Regretfully, there's also a question whether the presentation will be available. Yes, it will be on Eurosite's website in the yeah, where exactly that I don't know, but it will be, when you look for it, presentations, you will find it in the Eurosite website. Under Resource Center, yes. So once again, Liesbeth, thank you very much. It was a presentation that gives hope and that makes you feel positive about the potential of restoring biodiversity and stopping the decline of biodiversity. And it's also, you said that already maybe, but the aspect of wilderness and rewilding is also very appealing to people. I mean, we all like to be wild maybe a little bit and go into wild areas, although we don't have them really. But so the rewilding initiative and processes are very much also addressing the need for people to go into wild areas or considered wild areas. So thank you once again. Thank all the participants also. You might like to know that next week we will have our annual meeting in England, and also rewilding will be on the agenda of our meetings next week in Durham. So thank you and bye-bye and have a good evening.